2,000 years ago, the desert fortress Masada witnessed the tragic end of the First Jewish War against the Romans. The remnants of the battle remain for archaeologists to discover. Burnt wooden beams, arrowheads, sling stones, and ballista balls strewn in the ground, and a massive siege ramp built by the Roman engineers of the 10th Legion. But it's the chilling account from the historian Josephus that has sealed Masada's place in history. With certain defeat looming over them, the Judean rebels chose to die on their own terms rather than face capture by the Romans, killing themselves in a mass suicide. Men, women, and children. This event looms large in the cultural memory of the Jewish people, and it's even solidified in the national consciousness of the state of Israel today, as soldiers from the Israeli Defense Force have historically taken part in a swearing-in ceremony at Masada, reciting a slogan made famous by an Israeli poet: Masada shall never fall again. But what really happened here at Masada in the early 70s CE, and does the archaeological records support Josephus' account of the events? Masada was built as a getaway palace fortress by Herod the Great, the famously brutal king of Judea and a client to the Roman Empire. And he wasn't messing around. Located on a high plateau overlooking the Dead Sea, Masada is an extremely defensible position. Steep cliffs on all sides makes it almost impossible to attack. To approach, you need to hike up a winding trail called the Snake Path, which visitors can still use today. I'm in reasonably good shape, and this hike exhausted me. Now, imagine trying to march up this same path in Legionnaire armor, shield, and weapons, with defenders chucking stones down at you. Yeah, no thank you. A network of water cisterns was engineered to catch rain to supply the fortress with water. Dwelling spaces were built directly into the wall and could be filled with rubble to reinforce it during the siege. And never a man to skimp on the niceties of Roman lifestyle, Herod also built an insanely impressive palace on a series of terraces on the north side of the mountain. But this story is not about Herod. Masada is most famous for the event that occurred 75 years after his death, as the site of the Jewish rebellion's last stand against the Roman invaders. Now, Judea had long been under Roman rule, but in the late 60s CE, the population revolted, leading to the devastating sack of Jerusalem in the year 70, when the Romans destroyed the Second Jewish Temple. A rebel force under the command of Eleazar Ben-Yair held out at Masada for several more years until the 10th Roman Legion attacked it during the winter of 72 or 73 CE. All of our data about the siege of Masada comes from two sources: archaeological data, and the historian Josephus in Book 7, Chapters 8 and 9 of his account, The Jewish War. The archaeological evidence in particular is indispensable for what it tells us about Roman war tactics. Even today, you can see the remnants of the siege, in what the archaeologist Gwyn Davies calls the most complete surviving siege system of the ancient world. It includes a series of encampments built around the plateau. Here's one, here's another, and another. 8 camps in all, where the Roman soldiers and field engineers lived during the siege. When I visited the site, I couldn't help but imagine what it would have been like to be a Judean defender of this fortress. Sure, you're perched up way up high in a super defensible position, but you're looking down at a bunch of Roman camps filled with legionnaires. This must have been a blow to anyone's morale as you watch a professional army go about their daily preparations to try to kill you. But the most impressive feature is probably the Roman siege ramp, still visible on the western side of the plateau. Since it was nearly impossible to march in formation up the Snake Path, and since the rebels were well supplied with both food and water, the Romans must have decided it would be easier to build their own artificial road to get soldiers and siege machinery up to the wall itself for a full frontal assault. And that's exactly what they did. The Roman engineers piled up earth to the wall, built an ironclad siege tower 30 meters tall, at least according to Josephus, and topped it with a battering ram. But, according to Josephus, the siege came to a bitter and unexpected end. He reports that after the Romans had battered through the wall and a full-scale invasion of the fortress appeared imminent, the Jewish commander Eleazar convinced his men to commit mass suicide in order to avoid capture. But rather than kill themselves and their wives and children individually, the men drew lots to designate 10 among them to kill everyone else. After this, these 10 men drew lots again to choose one man to kill the other 9, leaving only one to kill himself. So, for what it's worth, technically only one person killed himself, according to Josephus. When the Romans finally overtook the fortress, they found everyone dead except for a handful of women and children who had hid themselves in a cave. But as the only source of this event, we can't be 100% sure of its accuracy. Josephus wasn't there, and he claims to have learned this story second or third hand, presumably from the women who hid themselves or the Romans that they reported the story to. Moreover, Josephus seems to have liked to embellish his stories. After all, he was motivated to tell a good story for his audience. Mass suicides in particular appear throughout his history, as he frequently describes Judean soldiers committing suicide rather than being taken captive by the Romans, such as at a battle at the town of Gamla, where the defenders decided to throw themselves off a cliff rather than lose to the Romans. And this raises the question, was mass suicide by Judean defenders really such a common practice? Or was this rather a favorite literary trope that Josephus uses to paint the Judeans in a heroic light? Now, archaeological evidence doesn't give us any definitive answers one way or another. Archaeologists have discovered a dozen pottery shards with Jewish names on them, including the name Ben-Yair itself, which some have interpreted as the actual lots that were drawn to choose the 10 men to kill everyone else. Archaeologists also discovered 3 skeletons in the lowest terrace of the northern palace complex, a man, a woman, and a child, and they presumably died violently. The man was near scales of armor, and the woman's hair and sandals were still intact, which can still be seen in the Israel Museum today. The original excavator interpreted this as the family of the final man standing, but there's no way to confirm this. To make matters even more complicated, the Romans would have probably removed any dead bodies, since they stationed a garrison there right after taking the fortress, and this would have left no evidence for archaeologists to find 2,000 years later. Other data suggests that the defenders fought to the bitter end rather than committing suicide. Some archaeologists have interpreted a mound of dirt against the northern palace complex as evidence that the Romans built yet another siege ramp once they entered the fortress, which would make sense if the defenders had retreated to the palace for a desperate last stand. In the end, archaeology cannot corroborate the finer-grained details of Josephus's account, though we should at least recognize that his account and the archaeology do agree insofar as the Roman siege works are concerned. For the rest of the story, we just need to trust Josephus at his word. Today, Masada is the most visited tourist site in Israel, and I'm not surprised. It's amazing. You can stargaze there, you can ride a cool cable car up to the top to skip the ridiculously tiring snake path, and you can look out over the Dead Sea for an impressive desert panorama. But as someone who studies ancient history, I couldn't stop an eerie feeling come over me as I wandered around the site. Whenever I visit an ancient town or village, I always try to imagine what it was like to live there. But this little thought experiment is disturbing when it comes to a site made famous by a hopeless battle and a mass suicide. Standing in a breach, fighting off an enemy army makes for a good movie, but it's a terrifying aspect of ancient warfare that I'd rather never experience. As always, thanks for watching.